Well, hello everyone. Thank you all for being here today. I'm Crystal Upperman. I'm a senior manager at Deloitte in the Sustainability, Climate, and Equity offering. Today we have a panel of distinguished guests who have joined us here at the 8th University of Maryland Symposium on Environmental Justice and Health Disparities with SEEGE, which is known as the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health. Today's panel is actually going to cover the topic of the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA for short. We'd like to start with some brief introductions to our distinguished panelists. Please tell us about yourself and your work.
I'll go first. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jill Witkowski-Heaps. I'm a senior attorney with Earth Justice. I'm out of the Northeast office, but I come to you from outside of Buffalo, which is the traditional home of the Haudenosaunee people. Before, I've spent a lot of time of my career in the clinical environmental space. So I worked at the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic, at the Vermont Environmental Law Clinic, and the Buffalo Environmental Law Clinic, and also spent some time actually in the DMV area in Annapolis with the Choose Clean Water Coalition, which is a sponsor of the conference, and have spent almost 2 decades litigating NEPA on behalf of communities. I'm really excited to be here today with these amazing panelists. Thank you.
Omar?
Good afternoon, everyone. Omar Muhammad. I am the Executive Director for the Low Country Alliance for Model Communities here in the city of North Charleston. And our organization actually used NEPA twice as to form a community mitigation agreement, one with the Port States Authority here in South Carolina and the other one with Palmetto Railways. And today, hopefully, we will talk about some of the benefits of the NEPA and how communities can use NEPA to their advantage.
Next, we have Vernice. Still on mute, Vernice. There you go.
Thank you. Executive Vice President for Environmental and Social Justice at Metropolitan Group, which is a social change agency. And I come to this work with almost 40 years of experience and activism around environmental policy, environmental justice, civil rights, and the intersection of those things. And NEPA hit my radar screen in a big way when we being the neighborhood that I lived in West Harlem in New York, began a decades-long battle with the city of New York, the state of New York, and EPA Region 2 around the siting of the North River Sewage Treatment Plant. And so in that process, which was about a 10-year battle, I went back to graduate school and went to planning school and really began to research where and how NEPA showed up in the siting of this mostly federal facility in our community that really tore our lives asunder. And I realized that neither EPA nor any state or municipal agency had ever thought to do a NEPA analysis around placing the giant North River Sewage Treatment Plant with no odor control devices in our community. And the rest, as they say, is history. And so I've been bird dogging NEPA ever since, and noticing its consistent lack of application to EJ issues in EJ communities.
Thanks, Vernice. Next, we have Debbie.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here today. My name is Debbie Chizewer, and I'm the managing attorney of Earth Justice's Midwest office located in Chicago. We opened this office 3 years ago and are excited to bring more fighting power to the Midwest, particularly to communities facing harms just as Vernice described. And I'm interested to talk about how NEPA can be a tool and what to look out for in that application of NEPA. So thank you for having me here today.
Awesome. And thanks, but not last but not least, we have Millie.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I feel like I'm perhaps helping round out the panel. I come from Washington State. I'm currently in Olympia, Washington. My name is Millie Piazza, and I'm the program manager of our newly established Office of Equity and Environmental Justice at the Department of Ecology, which is our state's environmental regulatory agency. And I have been personally and professionally working in the field of environmental justice for about 3 decades now. And I'm coming to this panel with my bureaucratic hat, as a state government staff person who is fully a dedicated resource in the agency, one of the few for 30 years and certainly the last 15 years in environmental justice. That landscape has radically changed. The attention to NEPA, I would say, has even radically changed in a couple of years. And I'm going to have a little bit of an extended intro here before we move into presentations, because when I think about environmental justice, from the seat of a bureaucrat, I think about two primary things. How can we move to being a process and an agency that views communities as the drivers in decisions that impact them? And how can we consistently and strategically make decisions as an agency to do work in ways that strategically address environmental and health disparities? And does NEPA do this? Not in my experience. Could it do this? Maybe, but I'm hoping that as we move through our conversation and time together today, we might also thread in some of the very practical and implementation aspects of NEPA on the process. How do we scope a project? Who gets to weigh in on what goes into an environmental impact statement? How do we do analysis? Who decides who a community is, whether it's a community of color, whether it's a low-income population, 10%, 80%, 29%? What is a significant or disproportionate impact generally, and then specifically for an area with environmental justice considerations? I'm thinking about, what is the role of community? Is it part of the scoping process, or are we really using it simply as a checklist for public comment and comments on the final document? And then when it comes down to the decision making, who really makes that decision? And does it actually reflect the needs and the voice that we heard? And does it address injustices and disparities? These are huge things that I do not have guidance on, do not have training on, and have had to create from within. And really, we should be creating together. So just some thoughts to maybe get our brains working together as a session on this. But thank you all so much. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Millie. Amazing thoughts. Definitely when it gets to implementation, I get really excited, because that's when you get in, doing the good work for sure. So we have a really jam-packed session planned for you all today for sure. But we're going to kick it off with two short, brief presentations that will cover some NEPA topics. And our first presenter will be Jill.
Hi, and I want to apologize in advance because I have some really cool animations that apparently don't work on this platform. So I apologize, but today I'm going to talk really about some basics about NEPA. What is it? For those of you who might be new to NEPA, answering the question, does it work? Can it ever work for communities? Focusing a little bit on what the Trump administration did to undermine NEPA. And really what impact we've seen. And then the how do we make NEPA better, I think, is going to be mostly for a group conversation at the end. So NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, is our first environmental law passed in 1969. And it's really a look before you leap. And this is me having leapt off that bridge in South Africa. NEPA, like me jumping off a bridge, doesn't force you to make a good decision. It just makes you think about what decision you're making, right? Look at the environmental impacts of the decision, the community impacts of the decision before you go forward. And one of the key pieces of NEPA is that you're looking at the direct, the indirect, and the cumulative impacts. So not just, for example, a pipeline, the exact place where the pipeline is, but what does the pipeline connect to? What happens if the pipeline leaks? Has there been other pipelines or other projects in the area? And this is really important to get a clear picture of the impacts before a go, no go on federally funded projects. So this is all for federal projects. So a quick community story about how NEPA can actually work to benefit communities and be really critical for communities. This is the Industrial Canal in New Orleans. On the right side of the circle is the lower 9th Ward. Industrial Canal connects the Mississippi River, which winds through Louisiana down to the Gulf, to the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, or the MISTERGO, which is a straight shot, basically a ship channel to the Gulf of Mexico. And the Army Corps of Engineers wanted to replace the Industrial Canal because it replaced the lock on the canal because it was too narrow and they were figuring it was just holding up ship traffic. So they wanted to dredge it and make a bigger lock. One of the problems, though, is that because it's the industrial canal, there's all sorts of nasty junk at the bottom of the canal. And one of the things that happened is the environmental review the Army Corps did is that they didn't actually take a hard look at where the contaminated sediments were and what impact it would have dredging them out and putting them next to the community. So this here, the red circle is the community, the lower 9th Ward. The yellow star is where they were going to put the sediment in a, quote, confined upland disposal facility, which is basically we're just going to put them in the wetlands next to the community and next to the canal. So the community, led by the Holy Cross Neighborhood Association in the lower 9th Ward and Louisiana Environmental Action Network, brought a lawsuit. NEPA was a really important claim, as was RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And the claims were twofold, which is, one, you haven't seen how nasty and contaminated it is, and so you need to do more study under NEPA. Or if you admit that it's contaminated, you actually have to take all the stuff you dredge to an upland hazardous waste facility. While we were litigating, this happened. So August 29th, 2005, Hurricane Katrina. And Hurricane Katrina basically funneled up the Mistergo into the lower 9th Ward, and that yellow star is where they were going to put that contaminated material right next to the community. And that area was inundated with 20 feet of highly erosional water. So if this lawsuit hadn't stopped the dredging, basically contaminated material would have been all over the lower 9th Ward and the lower east side of New Orleans. And this is what it looked like in the lower 9th Ward. This is the industrial canal that actually was breached by this big red barge. So what happened is we won. Hooray! We said the court basically said you have to go back and take core samples to figure out where the contamination is and do another deeper study. So all's well that ends well, except they came back again and said, we still want to do this, and we're going to do a deep draft lock. But as you can see, so here's the winding, in the middle of the page is the winding Mississippi River, and then the straight shot Mistergo. And after Katrina, because the Mistergo funneled the hurricane into New Orleans, the powers that be decided that that was going to be silted in and it was going to be shallow. And so what they were trying to do was basically a canal to nowhere. They were trying to build another deep draft lock to a shallow canal. And so we'll sued again, saying you can't, that doesn't make any sense. Why are you building a deep lock? And we won again. And now in 2017, they proposed another shallower lock. So after 2 lawsuits and multiple legal wins, the moral of the story is, while there are some really great things that NEPA can do to pause, that really the funding decisions and the go, no go on the projects are really political choices, and that you need a community to come together and organize to really undo these poor decisions that are being made that impact the community. So Trump undermining NEPA. So when Trump got into office, he did this 2017 immediate executive order about expediting environmental reviews and approval for high priority infrastructure projects. So the executive order basically says, do everything faster and let's do some checklists. And we really want to push, but it was an executive order, so it had limited applicability and effectiveness. So agencies that really wanted to do this could go ahead and have full permission to really do things very quickly, but it didn't have the weight of the regulatory requirements. Interestingly enough, though, this Trump move for especially infrastructure and speeding reviews on infrastructure is something that we've seen for many years. In fact, so Safety Lou, great acronym there, was actually George W. Bush law that he signed into effect. Congress had pushed that through to also get infrastructure going through more quickly. And the FAST Act was promulgated under President Obama. He had signed that. And these were all just trying to get faster NEPA requirements and particularly for high priority infrastructure projects, in part because these infrastructure projects are pork projects for legislators. And they're trying to get these little bridges and roadways for their constituents. And back in the day of earmarks, which are now come back, there were thousands of them. And so each politician wants their project for their local community to go fast. Now, for the last budget, there were 4,000 earmarks of $8 billion for different infrastructure projects. But Trump, big move to undermine Nepa was actually a regulatory change, rolling back the bedrock CEQ regulations, the Council for Environmental Quality regulations, axing a cumulative impact analysis, reducing public input. And these actually went into effect at the end of his term in September 2020. So there were several years of his term where they were not, these NEPA were more a suggestion rather than enforceable. And so a little Regulation 101 about why Trump had limited effect on NEPA, in my opinion. So normally you have a law like the Clean Water Act, and you have one agency that does the regulations, like EPA. For NEPA, and sorry, this is where the animations were really great. NEPA has, the CEQ does these big broad regulations, but then there are multiple agencies that have their own implementing regulations. So Department of Transportation, the Army Corps, Department of Interior, all have their own. So Trump basically changed the CEQ regulations, but the agencies had not changed their own implementing regulations by the time President Biden came in 2021 and basically undid those changes, put a halt to them. So Department of Transportation, for example, in December 2020 had proposed regulations, and those never went into effect. Quick community story on this. This is the Iroquois National Wildlife Refuge here in Western New York. A local development agency, an economic development agency with money from New York State, decided that they want to build a mega industrial site for, quote, green energy right next to the Tonawanda-Seneca Nations Reservation. So they bought the land with state money, and they want to build a 6 million gallon discharge pipeline through the wildlife refuge to discharge into a really small creek. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did an environmental assessment. There are many aspects of it that they didn't actually look at. For example, the project purpose and need, they just assumed that there was a need for this project, even though there's nobody actually building on the site yet. The alternative that the agency, so it's the applicant here that did all the environmental review, which is something that you see often in NEPA. It's not the federal agency that's doing a review, it's the applicant. And so the applicant's alternative said, instead of going through the Iroquois National Wildlife Refuge, we'll just send the pipeline through the Tonawanda Wildlife Management Area. So the impacts are the same. So that was their no action alternative, is to go through the other wildlife area. They only looked at the segment of the pipeline in the refuge, and they didn't look at where the pipeline is going or where it's coming from. And they completely ignored the fact that this whole development is right next to the nation's reservation. And this all happened actually in July 2020, which was before the Trump regulations went into effect. So because the Trump regulations were only, in effect for a short amount of time, it's questionable as to how much they impacted. But agencies like this, if they want the project to go forward, have been doing sloppy environmental review for a long time. And one quick one, this is, a problem with environmental review is that, they say they're doing environmental review, but does it really actually mean anything? So here in Buffalo, there's the Kensington Expressway, which was done in the 60s and basically divided an existing Black community, tore out a beautiful parkway designed by Frank Law Olmsted, and basically dug a trench of a roadway to separate the community so that white commuters from the suburbs could get to downtown faster. Now the state is trying to undo this, and they're looking at how to build a better expressway. So they're doing this. This is from their scoping, which just came out at the end of June. And they're like, hey, we're going to do an air quality analysis, right? I'm going to zoom in so you can see. So the air quality, they did some sampling on 2 days in March. And then they looked at the national ambient air quality standards, and they said, wow, the samples are below the national standards, so there's no air impact from this roadway that goes through the community. And so because they think there's no air impact from a roadway going through a community, they don't even look at health impacts of the objectives for this project. The project is to reconnect so it can look nice, right? we're impacting the visual and aesthetic, completely ignoring the fact that this roadway that has gone through this community for decades has harmed the health and the well-being of the community. So, you know, we've got, even when NEPA is being done, if it's being done in a shoddy manner and you're saying, well, there's no air impacts, therefore we don't need to address the air impacts, you're going to spend billions of dollars on this project that may not really even help the community in the way that you want it to. And so to set it up for the rest of the discussion, the question, can we fix it? I think we can. I think there's some big picture things that Millie has already alluded to, and some other tactics that we can use. And I look forward to hearing what the rest of my colleagues have to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we will now make sure that our next presenter is lined up to speak. The floor is yours, Debbie.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to pick up where both Jill and Millie left off on this idea of whether NEPA is an effective tool or a box checking exercise, and what we need to do to make it more effective. And I want to start by noting that, as Akeisha Daniels, who's pictured here, said about her situation, she said, quote, "I moved into the West Calumet housing complex in East Chicago, Indiana in 2004, when my youngest son was less than a month old. But it wasn't until 2016 that I found out the home I lived in was poisoning my children," unquote. And I think I'll tell you a little bit more about Akeisha's story and then move into the NEPA part of it. Her story, Akeisha's story, takes place in East Chicago, Indiana, which is in Northwest Indiana. And you can see on the slides, it's just about 25 minutes from Chicago along Lake Michigan. And in East Chicago, a century of activity at manufacturing facilities and smelters left behind a legacy of lead and arsenic. And there is a very contaminated Superfund site being cleaned up there even today. And the Superfund law, as you may know, is designed to address the most contaminated hazardous waste sites in the nation. What you might not know is that 70% of all Superfund sites are located within 1 mile of federally assisted housing. And the story of where Akeisha and I met, and the work we did together with many others, is an example of a multifaceted environmental justice story, and one of the many pieces involved NEPA. So the story of East Chicago and the West Calumet housing complex began in 1966, when the then director of public housing essentially decided to place public housing on top of the footprint of a former lead smelter that had not been remediated. And it was intentional. He was quoted in the Chicago Tribune at the time saying that it was an undesirable location, but other Black and brown people lived nearby, so that made the most sense. For decades, as you heard, residents lived at this complex with no idea that their homes were built on toxic land. That is even when HUD and the local public housing authority were making decisions to improve the buildings, rehab buildings, invite more people to live there. The first time that residents heard about it was in 2016, when they heard that the soil was so contaminated with lead and arsenic that they would need that, and it was over 225 times the action level that EPA was using at this Superfund site. So the action level was 400 parts per million, and people had up to 90,000 parts per million of lead in their soil. Yet residents learned from a letter from their mayor that they needed to move out of this housing complex in 60 to 90 days because it was that contaminated. That's 1,100 residents, 348 families being told they need to move immediately. And that after they move, the housing would be demolished. Well, as you can imagine, what ensued was total chaos. There was no plan for residents to be able to move successfully. And so in my work then at the Northwestern Environmental Advocacy Clinic and alongside the UChicago Environmental Law Clinic and the Shriver Center on Poverty Law and the Loyola Law School Health Clinic, we got engaged to support the residents. The Shriver Center filed a civil rights complaint against the local housing authority before HUD. And basically they said this is, a chaotic process that's unjust. This relocation is not in accordance with the rules. And they successfully negotiated a voluntary compliance agreement where residents would be given more time to find housing so that they wouldn't end up with a more dangerous situation. They were given rent abatement and other support. But after the residents moved out, HUD wanted to do a demolition of the housing. And they drafted an environmental assessment under Nepa quietly. In fact, despite all the attention to this site, all these lawyers involved, all the public outcry, it was in the press quite a bit, none of us knew that they had done this environmental assessment under Nepa. Frankly, we found out by accident. A local Indiana lawyer spotted it in a small squib in the legal news and alerted us. And due to concerns that the demolition would further contaminate or recontaminate the soil and nearby homes, because there were several hundred residents who were still living in homes adjacent to this evacuated housing complex. The residents, with our support, challenged HUD's demolition plans for the complex. And what we did first was say, hold on, you need more time. The public didn't know about this. We need more time for public comment, and you need to have a public hearing, and we were able to secure that. This was not something that the housing lawyers were accustomed to. This is not a place where housing lawyers typically engage. And I'm basing that on experience of speaking at housing conferences and repeatedly asking housing lawyers, how many of you commented on an environmental assessment? And out of rooms of 100, we get 1 or 2. And so we had this opportunity to cooperate across disciplines and comment on the environmental assessment. And it was truly a wild plan, an unbelievable plan. They were going to dig out 12 inches of soil to excavate utility pipes, and that was going to expose contaminated groundwater that would just be flowing around the site. It was going to, and then at the end, instead of taking that dirt, contaminated soil away, they were going to put the 12 inches back in the same order so that EPA could deal with it later. They also concluded, even though it was on a Superfund site, that there were no adverse environmental impacts of the demolition. So luckily, in response to the community's comments, HUD did make substantial changes to the demolition to try to reduce the risk of exposure to the contaminants. But they did go forward with demolition, as you can see in this picture, even without doing a full environmental impact statement or really deeply considering the impacts. We were pleased with the changes, but it was not nearly enough. But what happened next is that the work of the residents and our collaboration together really inspired the group of lawyers to do a report to really understand where else this was happening and what HUD, just to focus on the NEPA part, what HUD was doing about implementing NEPA. And what we learned is that in many cases, there was a failure to ensure that residents are notified of contamination near their homes. Residents are often not given a choice to move when contamination is found. There is a failure to include environmental health analysis in housing inspections. And most importantly here, there is a failure to take a hard look before investing in construction and redevelopment in contaminated places. And this is a little bit of a small picture, but I just wanted to show it because even after this project, HUD released, there was an Inspector General report about this particular situation. And I have, I'll just read to you because I know it's hard to read, but they noted that there were studies, there was information available that the health risks were there. There were 30% of children had extremely elevated levels of lead in their blood, and yet they continue to do redevelopment and projects without doing studies, without doing proper environmental assessments. And as Akeisha Daniels, who you saw in the first picture, explained, the report doesn't tell me and my neighbors anything new. The report says that the HUD and other agencies, quote, missed opportunities to identify the lead and arsenic contamination. And what she said after that is really powerful and is a reminder of why NEPA is so important. How could the Inspector General describe HUD's failure to prevent the poisoning of families like mine as, quote, missed opportunities? What about the opportunities our children are missing due to permanent lead damage, or what anyone is doing to help children's health issues going forward, or to prevent this happening from another community? And so I want to end by saying NEPA really matters, and understanding the impacts of a project on a community is vital, and we must protect that. And so I leave you with these 3 recommendations for HUD about updating its guidance to ensure that anytime it is going to do a review, EPA is notified and engaged in that with HUD in that process if it's near a contaminated site, that the low-income housing tax credit program should be subject to NEPA, and that agencies doing the NEPA analyses improve their processes. And with that, I'll turn it back to the group for our discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I have to say that stat you just quoted earlier on is very galvanizing. The fact that 70% of all Superfund sites are within 1 mile of federal housing is just, wow. More and more, it just piles up. So we'll get into our discussion at this particular moment, but to reflect on what Jill said early on, she mentioned just in 1969 that the passage of NEPA was really marked as just this revolution in the environmental monitoring and management space. We know that the act, being sort of newly established at that time, also implemented sort of an environmental review process that standardized federal agencies' roles and also their responsibilities concerning permitting, compliance monitoring, and enforcement. We all know for a period of time of doing all this work, importantly, many advocates have been able to leverage NEPA, as your presentations have showcased, to advance environmental and climate justice. But I would like to get perspectives from our panelists, like what has NEPA meant for environmental justice communities? Furthermore, does it really protect frontline and fence line communities? And if so, why not, if not?
I guess I can jump in and start that conversation. I know Vernice would like to jump in as well and get that going. So I can say from our lived experience from dealing with this, and it's a hellish process for communities. One, because there's no standardization on how federal governments go about implementing NEPA. So it means that each time that a federal project that NEPA applies and communities are trying to apply NEPA, it's almost like you're chasing your tail every time with every different agency that is responsible for the permitting, right? And it's almost like you're educating them on what they should already know how to, what should be evaluated, what should be included in the analysis. And I can tell you, it is highly frustrating. Because right now we're dealing with 2 NEPA projects, one in a settlement community here where a road wants to go through, and the other one is a sound wall for a community that is low wealth, that is elderly, that is disproportionately impacted. And it is highly frustrating because we cannot get the type of response that we need federal agency to just do their job. For one, we just cannot get that going. So to answer that question, I would say that NEPA is designed to help communities, but I believe the federal agencies are falling short in their implementation of the intent of NEPA. They do not do a robust environmental justice analysis. If they do an analysis at all, it's a risk assessment. It's not cumulative at all. So we, unfortunately, our organization is called on in the Low Country to help communities do this work because we have to do the studies. Our organization have to collect the dollars, collect the dollars to do analysis, to put in public comment that the federal agencies should be doing. That's a shame.
And I would just follow that up by saying so many things from these two presentations, from Jill and Debbie's presentation, just really spoke to me. And knowing a fair amount about the work and the organizing that Omar and his colleagues have done in North Charleston just leads one to sort of think back on the history of NEPA. And NEPA's like I was just on a panel before lunch on Title VI. And Title VI has been around. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act has been around since 1964. But people act like they've never heard of the Civil Rights Act or the powerful enforcement mechanisms that are contained within Title VI. And people do the same thing with NEPA. There was a national hue and cry when NEPA was passed in 1969. No, the authorizing legislation didn't come forward until 1971, but the environmental community largely, jumped for joy. And NEPA is potentially a very, very powerful tool, but you have to use the tool. You have to enforce the tool. NEPA is really a beautifully written, like the Civil Rights Act, one of the most beautifully written and constructed pieces of federal legislation. So is NEPA, but it's only paper unless you actually intend to use it, and unless you actually intend to use it in all of its applicability. So NEPA has two compartments in it, two components in it that are unique to the National Environmental Policy Act. One is a cumulative impact assessment. It's the only place in all of federal and environmental legislation that there's a statutory requirement to do an cumulative impact assessment. Of course, it would have helped if between 1971 and 2022, somebody had actually defined what that is, wrote it down, and told people how to actually do it. But they didn't do that. But there it is, nonetheless. And then social impact analysis. NEPA is also the only place in federal legislation that requires a social impact analysis. But again, it's only as powerful as you use the tool. And so what I've seen in my own experience in New York, and certainly from the examples that Jill and Debbie have given, and Omar's experience in North Charleston, is so NEPA applies to federally funded programs or projects, right? When the federal government has an interest, they don't give a damn about what else stands in their way. So the industrial canal widening, that was about increasing the economic productivity of the port of New Orleans. That was the only objective for the Army Corps of Engineers, is how to make that happen. Not what are the ecological implications of that dredging and that widening. What are the environmental implications on nearby populations? How will it affect the long-term ability for the Gulf to be able to restore and repair itself? None of that was a consideration for the Army Corps. How to widen the industrial corridor so bigger, deeper ships could move through. That was the singular interest, right? And when Debbie talked about the issues in East Chicago, that data point that she gave follows closely behind a critical data point that really started my whole entry into this field, which is the publication of the report Toxic Waste and Race in 1987, where we found that 3 out of 5 Superfund sites are located in predominantly communities of color. So when you add that data point to the data point that Debbie shares, you see that there's some intentionality about distributing risk. And if the federal government is the actor, they don't even use the tools that they have to mitigate that risk. And so, NEPA has a lot of applicability, but like the Civil Rights Act, only if you use it and only if you believe that the populations that are potentially affected are deserving of equal protection before the law. And so when your own government over decades has not done that and has not lived to the letter of the law, you get this sort of stasis moment that we're in. We see great opportunities opening up, but people are very sanguine that has anything to do with them. And I'll leave it there.
I'll just add on to something that Omar had said about, the process being so different and being so onerous for communities. Like, I have not seen a NEPA process that a community could navigate by themselves. You need lawyers, and probably a lot of lawyers. And currently litigating a case in Erie, Pennsylvania about expanding a waterfront roadway. And we're representing NAACP in Erie and Penn Future. And so this is the state Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, but they get federal funds. So the state hired a contractor, right, to do all the NEPA analysis. And boy, are they good at creating paperwork. They can create a lot of paperwork. And so they did a fast track environmental analysis. So environmental impact statement is the big one. Environmental assessment is the smaller one, which often can be thousands of pages. We got a categorical exclusion, which is there's no way that this is going to have any impact, so we don't even have to look at things. And our administrative record is 10,000 pages. So the short form is 10,000 pages. And you want to take a guess at how long the environmental impacts or the environmental justice analysis was? It was a page and a half. Out of 10,000 pages, that was the environmental justice analysis.
If I could comment, I'm just hearing so much richness here, and I'm thinking about that 10,000 pages, and I'm thinking about that page and a half, and what Omar was saying and what Vernice was saying. So our communities who may not speak English, who may not have access to broadband, are we going to be translating 10,000 pages? Are those 10,000 pages even meaningful to anyone other than the consultant and the agency that's preparing those pages and investing those monies? It's not even getting into the budget equity side of where those monies are going that are tax monies, right? But not to get too out there, but it does make me really think hard about those fundamental Title VI obligations, not even the disparate impact assessment, but just the fundamental, hey, who has access to this process to begin with? And Omar, thank you so much for your comments, because as a reviewer of both state environmental impact assessments and the NEPA and the national ones, the inconsistency between the content in an environmental justice analysis, is there or are there not acknowledgments of health impacts? How does anyone address cumulative impacts, which was kind of part of the conversation of this session? And then just the boilerplate, can we just say, and there are no significant impacts, thus there are no significant impacts on this particular community. These types of statements that we really need to question and call to the mat about the validity of such statements, and how we're even using any of those terms. How are we using disparate impact, disproportionate impact, communities, all of those terms? The devil is in the details, and we don't have consistency across agencies, let alone across analyses. So thank you all for those true seeds.
So I just want to follow up here, because there's a sub question that lingers in just what all of you have sort of mentioned in your remarks. So what is your take on cumulative impacts across the board, and how can we get closer to achieving cumulative impact evaluation in the NEPA process?
Well, we need a new scientific approach, right? I don't mean we need new science. I don't mean we need new chemistry or we need physics or new physics. We need a new regulatory approach that accumulates and aggregates scientific data in a way that our environmental regulatory system is not designed to meet, right? So we've been asking for a cumulative impact assessment, but we don't have a regulatory framework that is meant to aggregate with that. Our regulatory framework is permit by permit, facility by facility, pipeline by pipeline, or outfall by outfall, or smokestack by smokestack. But there is no regulatory framework that says you need to look at the combined impact of several operating facilities that emit pollutants. And what does that do to the ambient environment or the water or the soil? There is no regulatory framework to do that. And I think that's one of the reasons that it has been so hard to grapple with this. But at a minimum, I'm just thinking there's some common sense elements here. If a community already has X number of facilities, building a highway adjacent to them, building a roadway adjacent to them, allowing heavy duty vehicles to run through their streets only exacerbates that, right? So, and when Jill, what did you say was the finding that they all gave you, that there was no impact? What did they call it?
Oh, the categorical exclusion.
Categorical exclusion. So what we got for the North River Sewage Treatment Plant was 2 findings of no significant impact. 180 million gallons of raw sewage running through our community every day with no odor control devices. And EPA Region 2 gave that proposed development 2 findings of no significant impact. That's a Nepa definition, a finding of no significant impact. So people are not prepared to really want to do anything about this. And again, I go back to the marked vulnerability of certain populations, that it's okay if we create environmental burdens that no human is meant to live through. What Debbie described for the folks in East Chicago, no human being was ever meant to live in a circumstance like that. That's why we have a CERCLA, right? But we could apply CERCLA in, Jill, help me. What is the county where Love Canal is?
Oh, Niagara.
So Niagara County, New York, right? Which gave us Love Canal, which then gave us CERCLA. White subdivision. All the residents are white. Walking distance from that subdivision is public housing. They relocated the people who lived in the subdivision in Niagara County where they found the contaminants. You think those contaminants didn't migrate over to where the public housing was? Nobody ever talked about those people. Nobody ever thought to move them, right? So our whole regulatory framework is based on whose lives do we value? Whose property do we value? Whose communities do we value? And whose do we think are available for sacrifice and development? That is, and that has to change. That it's also illegal under many, many, many statutes. Every civil rights law says that that's illegal, but unless it's meaningful, it's useless. And I'm after 40 years of trying to convince communities to be engaged in these processes, after a while you get so cynical because you see so very few instances of where it works. Although I have been carrying around the work of LAMC in North Charleston for a long time in my heart, because it's a place where it really, really, really did work and communities really got an outcome that they drove.
I'll just add, Vernice, about, what communities we value. I think there's a special consideration for tribal and indigenous populations. The cumulative impact isn't just this moment in time right now, but the over time, what have we subjected this tribal or indigenous community to? And working with the Tonawanda Seneca Nation, this plot of land where the local economic development agency wants to use state money to build a mega industrial site right next to their reservation on land that was formerly a part of their reservation, was illegally taken from them. Years later, they were able to buy back a portion of the reservation, but now, this was their land and the state gave money to an economic agency. So the cumulative impact there needs to look at, collective trauma. What's the trauma there? How do we look at not just quantitative, we're just measuring certain air pollution, but what's qualitative? How do we take into account the community stories of the history over time, not just what facilities are there now?
Awesome. So apart from cumulative impact and looking at doing a cumulative impact assessment, we also have health impact assessments, which has become sort of a decision support tool that can provide some of the means for factoring evidence that's based on health considerations into the decision-making process. A lot of you had mentioned about just not looking at raw numbers of exposure, but also quantifying the relationship between that exposure and the health outcome and what that could mean. Would you all say that, our are health impact assessments being utilized enough in NEPA? And if not, how do you foresee health impact assessments being used to satisfy some of the NEPA requirements?
I mean, again, with our work, that was one thing that we put as part of the assessment, the environmental review and environmental impact assessment was to include community impact. And it was a hard lift, right? Acknowledgement that needed to be, included in the assessment. We provide journals and scholar work to reinforce the reason why we were asking for health impact assessment. And we were basically told, hey, we're required only to do a risk assessment, and that's where they landed. And we couldn't move them from a risk assessment viewpoint versus looking at cumulative impact or looking at health impact assessment. So I think having the ability within the NEPA process where cumulative impact, well, it's already written in there, right? I just don't think they know how to go about it. So they go with what they're familiar with, that's risk assessments, and then a clear picture of the impacts in communities. So what we have been pushing for years for cumulative impact and assessments as part of to no avail today.
All right, I can add that something that could be used both across the health impacts analysis or a cumulative impacts analysis is some kind of a threshold, which I think Vernice was getting at, where above which you could not move forward with the project, so that it's not just the checking the box. Yes, we see that all of these people have been harmed or will be harmed, and we're going to do it anyway because, as Vernice said, the decision makers might not value the impacted lives, but have an actual threshold above which that the decision must be no.
And I'll say here in Buffalo with the highway removal, which is a great project, they haven't even looked, because they're looking just at the numbers of the pollution numbers. They aren't looking at the lived experience of the community members who are saying, we are dying because of this roadway. And so basically just saying, well, that your numbers look okay compared to other near highway numbers, right? They're comparing highway numbers to highway numbers. And it ignores the whole fact of what impact is really being felt by the people in their lived lives. And, a health impact assessment could get to that. So even, in Buffalo, it's hard because people want this project to happen now. They want the roadway covered. They want better lives immediately. And a health impact assessment would slow things down. So how do you balance the needs of the community of really, recognizing the existing health impacts, but also not wanting to slow the process down and wanting to see progress right away?
What would be an interesting exercise? There's also, there are 3 standards within NEPA: build, mitigation, no build. And I'd just like to see an assessment or a survey. When faced with those 3 choices, which are within this NEPA statute, how many projects went with no build? Because they found information from social impact analyses, or the few that are now incorporating health impact assessments. How many folks went with no build, right? In our case, and I'm talking about a period from the 1960s to the 1980s, was the foundation of the issue that I'm talking about in New York with the North River Sewage Treatment Plant. A community south of us was the original location for the sewage treatment plant, and the great anti-Semite and racist Robert Moses decided that they were about to build, to redevelop the Upper West Side of Manhattan into something called the West Side Improvement Project, which included Avery Center, which included the Metropolitan Opera, which included the New York City Ballet, right? And it was going to be back a couple of miles away on the waterfront on the Hudson River. But he determined, no, that is not approximate land use or development that we're going to have near our glistening West Side Improvement Project. So they had to find another community along the Hudson River. And they found our community, but our community was the least geologically favorable place to put it, but they jammed it in across the street from where 100,000 people live. And when I went and looked back through the historical record, and I looked at every record that had been issued on this plant, on this facility, no one ever said, you know, that's maybe not the best approximate or proximate land use for that many people in a densely populated urban community. Maybe we need to find another location. There was no other analysis. There was no mitigation. And that happens again and again and again. So again, you know, NEPA is only as good as the energy and the emphasis that every agency, and it needs to be a multi-agency approach, right? The health impact assessments need to be done, guided by HHS, but also by state and local health departments. The environmental analysis needs to be done by the environmental agencies, the transportation analysis, the air analysis. And you hardly ever see that. You see a few people in one agency, usually the environmental agency, and that's not good enough. Somebody in the chat wrote also the folks who are completing phase ones, right? Phase one site assessments for these projects. And they're all engineers, but that they have no connection to the people who might be impacted by this project. So that makes me think maybe we need to focus on training of engineers, of environmental attorneys, of public health folk to really think about the social dimensions of decision making, so that these factors become routine and not some special case that, you know, 2,000 lawyers have to file on behalf of one single community to get a 1.5 page analysis within a 10,000 page document. It's too much to ask people to do, but nonetheless, people continue to do it and they don't give up. And, you know, that it's just the indomitable spirit of EJ, indigenous and other communities, that we don't give up, but we certainly have gotten the word in our face has been, you can fight until you're blue in the face. If we want to do this project, we're going to push this project through.
Wow, Vernice. So I think about NEPA, the fact that it's a healthy 53-year-old piece of law, and it's seen a lot of challenges from past leaders wanting to streamline development in protected areas, or, you know, these, we know that some of these changes still have resounding effects today. I'm just curious to know from our panelists, how have you seen Executive Order 13807, which was established under the Trump administration, which has directed CEQ to accelerate the federal environmental review and decision-making process? How have you seen it impact communities, and is it continuing to impact communities today?
Well, I'll just say that I don't know if this is a change, but with the Department of Transportation, we just had a really bad case that came out of Florida the other day about this use of a categorical exclusion, which is like a fast track, no public, you don't actually have to have a public hearing on anything or any public comment on the project, because because you've done so many of these projects like this, that there will never be significant impacts. And they're starting to use these for highway projects and bridge replacement projects. After they've done the analysis, they go back and say, look, there's no significant impacts. We're calling it a categorical exclusion, not the finding of no significant impact you got, Vernice. So the finding of no significant impact at least triggers like public comment, right? An environmental review. And we're seeing more and more that the departments of transportation are really trying everything to cut out public comment and cut out public input on these infrastructure projects.
Any other thoughts?
Well, I hate to talk about, think about, or acknowledge the previous administration. So I'm just going to move right forward, because almost from the moment the Biden administration, and I do mean from the moment, like, you know, I don't know what you all were doing the afternoon that President Biden was inaugurated. I was drinking a lot of champagne, a lot. And if I had been playing that drinking game where when they say a word, you have a drink. He said environmental justice and systemic racism so many times, I could have been plastered on the floor. So I was a happy camper just for him to say it in his inaugural address. But then he went back to his office, to the Oval Office, and he signed a bunch of executive orders. And within those executive orders that he signed were things that specifically addressed environmental justice, not by inference, but exactly definite, right on the head, right? And racial inequity. But they also went deep to try to unwind some of the damage that administration had done. And so, there is a posted on July 7th, environmental impact review, a reversal of almost everything that the previous administration tried to do to damage NEPA. And it is pretty good. And again, it's only as good as its enforcement, right? But it is pretty good in terms of not only did they try to unwind the damage, but they also tried to close some gaps and move us forward. But I just want to call people's attention to this legislation that is probably going to pass tomorrow. Again, I keep asking people, what's it called? Tell me again, Crystal.
It's the Inflation Reduction Act.
The IRA, includes a provision to fast track oil and gas permits, right, by the Department of the Interior and others, and bypass a lot of NEPA. So somebody, I'm not going to call any names, I think we all know who, made sure that not only would there be new oil and gas leasing opened up in what should be protected areas and what President Biden said were going to be protected areas and no drilling, but they're also created a strategy to go right through NEPA and right around NEPA to expedite these permits within 24 months, right? And so while the administration has done a really good thing in articulating how NEPA should really be enforced and what it should do, they're signing off on a piece of legislation. Most likely tomorrow, the House will pass it, and the president will probably sign it, if not tomorrow night, on Saturday. And, here we are back at square one. So, our words and our deeds have to match up, right? I have a lot of, I may be unusual in the crowd of people who are watching this session and who are participating in this conference. I have a lot of faith in President Biden. And the reason I have a lot of faith in him is because he grew up in a community in Wilmington, Delaware, with an active refinery and knows what it's like to live in an EJ community. I think that's why he's so passionate about it, because it was his experience growing up. But sometimes we do things that are politically expeditious that cost people their lives. And I think those of us who have been on the receiving end of those bad decisions are really, really, really tired of it. And when good people do bad things, it hurts that much more, right? And so enforcement, right? There's still a lot of mechanisms out there, enforcement in a lot of different agencies, at FERC, at the Federal Railroad Administration, at DOT. There are lots of things that people can do to make sure that this is not a giveaway. And that has to happen, because otherwise a lot of people are going to be sacrificed. And that cannot be the result of moving forward on climate policy. Cannot be, let's continue to sacrifice the same people in the same communities.
I see in the chat that there's a comment about current legislation, any affirmative current legislation. And I wanted to lift up the Environmental Justice for All Act, which could really improve the role that NEPA could have by addressing disproportionate harms through cumulative effects. And that passed out of the House Committee on Natural Resources on July 27th. And I don't know what's going to happen, but it might be a long road. But I think more pressure to get legislation like the Environmental Justice for All Act passed could be important in this moment.
And I'll just add, so we have these dueling, Trump did an executive order, which didn't really do much, right? But said do NEPA faster. Then he did regulations that took away cumulative impacts. Then Biden came in with an executive order that says don't do what Trump is doing. And then then came out, and now he has just come out with his own regulations that was restoring the initial cumulative impacts, the regulations from the 70s, plus doing something a little better. So those should be implemented. And he's actually going to do the plan is more protective regulations that directly address environmental justice. But there was also in the Senate, and Senator Manchin joined this, a movement to basically try to undo the regulations that Biden had just done. Now that's unlikely to pass the House, but it's, important to know that there's, political, if you see in the news, some of the coverage is like, oh, well, Biden is doing all this ridiculous stuff to like ruin projects from ever happening. And it's like, no, he's actually just restoring what had been the regulations for decades before Trump came in and took a hatchet to it.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I would love to implore our audience, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat so our panelists can get to them. I wanted to get, Millie, any thoughts from you about the ease or challenge of, implementing NEPA from a state perspective, given the vacillating decisions being presented and happening at the federal level?
I think it comes down to there's a comment in chat there, or there's a string of comments about training. And I think about that training, and I really think, so I'm from a state perspective, working and wading into the NEPA field and trying to provide comments on something that doesn't have standards of practice and accountability is an impossible dream and task. And so I was chuckling, but shout out to the social justice trained engineers comment in the chat there. It's really true. And it is, I suppose, yes, it is social justice warriors, but it should be the standard practice. And so the challenge, I'm sorry, it's so, I'm taking it like really, this is like the cubicle view, right, Crystal? This is like when I'm in my job doing my work every day, how do I do it without agreed upon like definitions on standards of practice? What is even in a chapter? Where are the headings in any of these things that a committee can just go to and read it and understand it? And what grade level is it at? Because I don't understand it. And so how do we move to a place where we have a common language and understanding, and ultimately where is the accountability? Like the dream is accountability in decision-making outcome. I'm ready to take at least a few big baby steps on at least accountability in content. And I don't see where the effort, well, let's reframe it positively. There is huge opportunity to invest in this area. And I wanted to make a quick note also that the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council is also trying to take a look at NEPA and really think about training. This is something that has come up again and again in meetings. Where is training? Both to equip the agencies, the federal agencies and state agencies, and then communities. Where is that free and accessible technical assistance to do this? Where is that legal support, that scientific support, the data support? Because these are multiple jobs. So a lot there. Oh, sorry. One more comment on the previous conversation too. I'm not going to wade into the political landscape, but I will say that the critiques, the pushback, the hatchets that you all, Jill, mentioned, those are instrumental in identifying for me weaknesses as well. Where do I need to shore up on strategy, on legal, legal justification? So, anyways, there's a, I don't know if I'd go so far as to call it a silver lining, but there's a benefit to seeing weakness. Sorry, that was a scattered response, but
it was very well thought out and eloquent. I have to say that there was a comment that was dropped about including the precautionary principle within the mix of NEPA itself. What are the panelists' takes on that? I see a lot of head nods. Who wants to chime in on that one? Just full scale agreement, no comment or opinions.
Well, yes, I think there is uniformity. But when you say the precautionary principle, people act like you're saying, let's implement communism. It's, prevention, pollution prevention. Let's think about the implications of something before we act. It seems like the most common sense thing that one could say. But whenever we introduce that into a conversation, we get marginalized for, what is that crazy thing you're talking about? But it should be the foundation of all environmental and public health policy. I just wanted to add that what Millie was just talking about in terms of training, there are some courageous public servants who have put themselves out on a limb. I think about, there was an engineer in EPA Region 5 who was the first person to actually identify that there was something amiss in Flint. And he wrote a report about it. And I think he was demoted so far down, you probably can't even find that man in the organizational chart of EPA anymore. Omar had an extraordinary colleague who worked for the city of North Charleston. She was an environmental planner, and she helped them to navigate the Title VI portions and the NEPA portions. And she did an incredible job. She lost her job for the city of North Charleston for stepping up and doing what was in fact her job, right? And that happens a lot to civil servants, both within the federal government, within state government, within local government. And I think we just need to acknowledge that when people do the right thing, it often costs them their career.
Wow, thanks, Vernice. So we're coming close to close of this conversation. I would love to get some closing remarks from our panelists, each person about 45 seconds, starting with Jill.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how you best fix NEPA. And really, I think under it all is if the people who lived in the communities had the power of the purse strings, if they could control how the money was spent, they would be the decision makers. And then they could be picking projects that are beneficial for the community and not just what the federal government wants to do or what, State Department of Transportation wants to do, but really from the community, and empowering communities to be in charge of the money that's spent in their community, I think could be ultimately the biggest win we could have.
Awesome. Thanks, Jill. On to you, Omar.
I think for us, having better processes in which federal agencies work and understand NEPA and the implementation of NEPA, and that the burden of proving impact, disproportionate impact, should not be on the community. And I think that would be very helpful to the community too. I think not only training for the professionals that work in the NEPA kind of area, but also training in the community, so that community, they are made aware of NEPA and the benefits that NEPA can offer. I can tell you that for us, our organization was the very first organization that mitigated with dollars, with dollars, $8 million total of 2 NEPA processes, which we're using today for impacting our community, building housing, impacting education, impacting built environment, impacting legacy pollution. Those are the success stories that need to be shared and replicated across the country on how you can use NEPA to address these systemic concerns when it comes to communities being overburdened and disproportionately impacted by these types of projects.
Awesome. Thanks, Omar. Over to you, Vernice. You're on mute.
That's why I keep the North Charleston example in my heart and in my soul, because they are the very first EJ community to receive a monetary mitigation plan under NEPA. What year was that, Omar? It's like just a few years ago.
It was 2005.
So from 1971 to 2005, we see one community receive 2 NEPA mitigation plans. Not to give up hope is what I would say, right? And to let the young folks who are coming into this space know that they got this, right? if they train themselves, if they train communities that they work with, if they believe that they are standing in a righteous place, they can move this conversation to the next level. And so I just want to lift them up, that this is a worthy fight, and that you do win every now and again. It might sound like we don't, but we do win every now and again. And when we do, it's a marvelous thing on behalf of the people that we work with.
Awesome. Thanks, Vernice. Debbie.
Wow, Vernice, you just captured how I'm feeling. I'm feeling fired up from this conversation, and I'm hoping that we can channel that into our work that we're doing right now with Bay Mills Indian community in evaluating the Line 5 tunnel project, which is an oil pipeline and that is currently under the Great Lakes, and they want to, as a solution to this risky pipeline, build a tunnel. I'm hoping that we can be one of these that Bay Mills can be a success story. And I'm thinking about the categorical exclusion example, and that's what I was referencing without saying that, with the low-income housing tax credit housing. Their Department of Treasury considers that categorically excluded. We need to get rid of that. So like, here's a specific thing, Bay Mills, a more general thing, like let's get rid of that categorical exclusion. And then third, let's stop anybody from shutting down Nepa and be defensive too.
Thank you. And on to you, Millie.
Thank you so much. I think, 3 things that really drive me. I think that number 1, we need to humanize data. Numbers, technical reports, that's great. Where is the humanity? How do we have that voice? How do we have that community research? How do we value that? How do we have those words and voice directly in something that we hopefully are accountable and I think that to tee off of what Omar, you're saying about these, shining light on these critical wins across the nation. They're still so isolated, like they're divided. How do we unite this pattern of success and move forward together as a bundle, right? Because as an agency, government, public service, we listen to the loudest voice. So who is that loudest voice? We need to be that loudest voice. Communities need to be the loudest voice, because the alternative voices are very, very loud. So just raising my hands to you all and my voice with you all. Thank you so much for this session.
Thank you, Millie. I would like to extend gratitude to all of you panelists, to the audience for joining us today. You've just heard a conversation that's centered around NEPA, its history and current state. And we thank you for participating in the 8th University of Maryland Symposium on Environmental Justice and Health Disparities. We hope you have a great rest of the symposium, and take care.